So intergenerational faith transmission. It's a fascinating, this project was about flourishing congregations. So at the Tim Center, we looked at 4 different case studies. And it isn't surprising that you would learn about intergenerational faith transmission when you're looking at flourishing congregations. But as we were looking at our 4 case studies, we found that there were a fair number of patterns that sorry, I'm just going to set my watch so I pay attention to the timing. We found that there were some patterns that repeated. And so we went looking to see what are the things that they're saying and what do those patterns tell us about the relationship between flourishing and intergenerational faith transmission. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the congregations. I'm not going to talk about the method. And we'll spend most of our time looking at signs of intergenerational faith transmission. So just a few things about the terminology. When we mean intergenerational, our case study participants meant lots of different things. For the purpose of this presentation, really this just means parents of any generation, of any age, trying to transmit their faith to their children of any age. And that isn't necessarily their own children, right? That's all we're talking about here. And when we mean faith transmission, that's not a phrase our participants used, but they talked about related ideas, programs, and actions, right? Passing on the DNA, having Sunday school, mentoring, things like that. And of course, for all these churches, this was a stated core objection, was intergenerational faith transmission. So let's talk about these 4 congregations very briefly. What we're calling Community Baptist, which is a church that was started in 1922, has about 120 congregants, very diverse congregation, a lot of university students. What we're calling Spiritual Wholeness, which is about 20 years old, about 60 congregants. It's a Chinese church operating in 3 languages with a particular emphasis on spiritual formation. Toronto Coptic Orthodox has somewhere between 12 and 1,500 attendees, services Saturdays, Wednesday, and Sundays and Saturday. 46 different ministries, but only 2 priests. Very interesting to see a church that size run by a very small number of paid ministers. Toronto Korean, founded in 1977 with an English ministry that started in 1992. Somewhere around 2,000 plus. We found with these larger congregations, there's so much going on, they don't actually have a good count of how many people participate in their ministries. But somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000, we're pretty sure. So those were chosen for diversity and because we wanted diaspora representation. So let's talk, well, I'll skip the method because you've already heard about that. And let's talk about each of these congregations in sequence and talk a little bit about what we learned about each of those churches. Community Baptist, family involvement. Whole family involvement, that's what we mean. Events where everybody of all ages can participate in some way, can get engaged with the church. That was the first indicator of faith transmission we saw. Ministry engagement, that's different from family involvement. That means not only are there events where everybody can show up and do things, but they're actually, people of all ages are expected to be involved in ministry of some kind. And so mentorship, so that the youngers mentor the old, training programs, and those kind of things, youth groups where youth are trained, that kind of thing. Staffing and leadership. This was a big factor throughout all our case studies. Everybody that we talked to in this congregation talked about this emphasis on youth. They told this story of how they worked to hire a community youth worker when they only had a very under 10 youth in their church. They talked with pride about hiring a young couple to be the ministers at their church. And by youth, they don't just mean we want youth, they mean we attend to youth, we're concerned about their development, we're aware of where they're at. Challenges. You might think that's a funny category when we're talking about flourishing, but the challenges that are identified by churches are an indicator of where their priorities are and what they think is important. And in this case, they were very aware of challenges related to faith transmission, like the transition of youth to college or university, like the fact that upcoming generations are different from older generations, that they had to be aware of that. that young families, you can't just sort of, expect young families to show up without specifically attending to the needs of young families. This church, the research assistants that were there, they kept commenting about how much the children were running around at all times with the events they observed. Spiritual Wholeness Church, which is the Chinese church. Again, you see this family involvement. And we mean everything. Like they have this spiritual retreat where they invite children, encourage children to pray during the spiritual retreat. Communal engagement, everyone in many events together. So families involved as families, but also the whole congregation involved as a whole congregation. Training. This church is a smaller church, but paid a lot of attention to training at all different levels. They have a very established training program for people that become members. You don't just agree to become a member. You have to go through their training program, which also pays attention to issues of faith transmission. Again, we see the importance of staffing and leadership. Staffing here is a married couple trained in spiritual formation in both Roman Catholic and evangelical traditions, but have made spiritual formation and spiritual direction the core of their ministry, and are very concerned that the youth are involved in this. They engage the youth in conversation, but also encourage them to be active participants in the ministry of the church. A measure of leadership and attending to faith transmission is they're concerned to have young people on the board. So they have several people in their 30s represented on the board. Again, they talk to challenges, language difficulties, because they operate in 3 languages. They actually simultaneously translate all their events into these 3 languages, depending on who's talking, because they want everybody involved, and they want children not to be, and people, younger generations that don't necessarily speak Mandarin or Cantonese, not to be excluded from the events of the church. And they also are aware of generational change and generational challenges. The first thing I want to talk about is architecture. Now, that might not, you think, well, what does that have to do with faith transmission? But in fact, it was a factor in all 4 of these churches. All 4 of them were concerned about how space was used and who had access to the space, and the degree to which there was space for all generations, individually, say youth group or children, but also as families. So architecture did play a substantive role in all of these congregations when it comes to faith transmission. But I wanted to mention this one because of the iconography. If you've ever been in a Coptic Orthodox church, you know that it's filled with ornamentation and icons. And if you haven't been in a Coptic Orthodox church, you really should visit. But what's distinctive about the iconography here is the representative people of different ages and different ethnicities in their iconography. It was absolutely fascinating. So they sort of built this right into the very visual representation of the church. Again, you see this strong emphasis on family involvement, including marriage classes that help people understand the nature of Coptic spirituality, programs for all generations, but also programs that bring people together as families and as a community. Ministry engagement, people doing ministry. Missions trips, which have a very strong representation of their youth group in their mission trips. Again, staffing and leadership. The picture that strikes in my mind is one of our researchers told a story of young children running to the head priest and grabbing his legs. And so you might not be aware, but Coptic services can last 3 or 5 hours. But they're okay with families coming and leaving and kids running around. Right? So this kind of leadership for those kind of areas. Again, concerned about challenges, much the same as what the other churches are concerned about. In Toronto Korean, you're seeing patterns here, I hope. Communal engagement, people of all different life stages getting together at the same time. Ministry engagement, including people of all different ages to be actively involved in ministry. Training, very extensive training program here, all ages, every conceivable demographic, everything from Sunday school to mentoring, to Bible study, to serving opportunities, to mission trips, to sports, lots going on in this church. And again, strong emphasis on leadership. And senior leaderships, everybody in these 4 churches mentioned the impact of the senior leader had in issues of faith transmission. This senior leader was a former youth pastor, was very concerned to transmit the DNA to a younger generation, very aware that that had to look differently than it did for older generations. And that's reflected in his hiring. They have 19 associate pastors, and there's several of them that are concerned with faith transmission. Again, aware of challenges, particularly cultural change, because they're a diaspora church. They have sort of people, it's sort of multicultural, multilingual, multi-generational, and so they're aware of those transitions. So what have we found? We've found many common actions across this idea that the whole community has to do things together. So young people see older people engaging in spiritual practices. Intentionality about faith transmission. It's not just, well, you know, if people come to church, then the faith will be. No, they all understood that they had to be very intentional about that. Some form of training looked very differently. Some of it was very formal, some of it was very informal, but there was all training and they were all aware that they were involved in those activities. The parental involvement, the importance of that, the importance of ministry engagement so that people didn't just show up, they were involved in ministry, and the strong emphasis on leadership support. Some of the things they mentioned about challenges that they're aware of is perception of declining belief. They didn't really articulate any specifics about it. They had this perception and were aware of it. Generational transition, cultural change, and engaging the young. So you might say, okay, that's fine. We have 4 examples here of churches. There's some patterns here, but that's 4 churches. They're very distinctive churches. Well, is this really represented in the larger literature? Well, let's look at the literature. And so you can't really see this, but this is the theory of intergenerational religious momentum, which is a very well-known, well-respected theory of intergenerational tradition that importantly looked at a very large number of families over time, right? So, and this is sort of the standard. We want to look at a large number, we want to look at it over time and see if these results hold up. And in fact, we see many of the same patterns we saw in our research. The importance of parental role model, the parent-child quality relationship, the influence of other adults, the need to intentionally transmit the religious inheritance, the role of the religious institution, attention to culture, right? So all these things show up in this model that we have seen in our 4 case studies. And so we can say that, yes, what we're seeing, what these churches are doing, we have some evidence that this works. And so we can learn from these things. Now you might say, well, this is an American study. You know, we know that Canada is different from the States. So do we have any evidence that some of these same things happen in Canada? Thankfully, the EFC has been doing a series of studies related to faith transmission. The most recent one is about families that you should look up and take a look. But I want to talk about the renegotiating faith research, which was particularly about this faith transition issue, particularly from high school to university and college. And they found many of the same things that we find in our data. The importance of faith mentors, the importance of groups that specifically attend to the needs of young people, the importance of paying attention to transitions, the attending to social media. We didn't see as much of that in our data, but there was some of it, and warm relationships with adults. All 4 of our cases recognized that they needed to have warm relationships with adults that were not necessarily their parents. So, in summary, in these 4 cases, we see that they follow many of the practices in the literature. So we can have some confidence that these practices, in fact, contribute to faith transmission, but not just arbitrary. Now, these churches didn't read the literature and then implement these things. They implemented them by listening to what God was doing in their setting and came up with very different ways of accomplishing those purposes. But they came up with very similar things, even though they're very different churches, which is very interesting. And so just to summarize some of these issues related to faith transmission, intentionality. Okay? Intentionality, engagement with families, whole community involvement, right? Everybody's involved. access to multiple adults, and leadership support. And so I think this is interesting data. We've got some evidence that it moves beyond these 4 case studies. And so that's just a brief overview of what we found about intergenerational faith transmission.